Myths and misunderstandings can come about in a myriad different ways in a game like Final Fantasy XIV. How exactly they come about can vary greatly, from misunderstanding what you think you saw, to assuming something works in a specific way, to sometimes simply that whether that exact thing is true or not doesn't matter that much, so you might not have bothered to look too closely. I want to go over a handful of these kinds of claims, myths and odd interactions, and either explain how they work, how they are false, or if they even are false in the first place. And if you know of some strange myths or claims you would like tested or explained, be sure to share them in the comments. Now, let's get myth busting. Number 1. How exactly does cover work? One of the surprisingly wackiest actions and effects in Final Fantasy XIV, just by design, with so many random exceptions and cases to explore that you can never truly be sure how it works without checking. In a way, this is like a nesting doll of myths, so let's start picking it apart. 1. Whose mitigation? A common source of confusion is whose mitigation applies when cover is in effect. Some believe that the damage is entirely dictated by defensive cooldowns on the target of cover. Some believe both players involved apply their mitigation. Some believe something in between. The way cover actually works in this regard is that the user of cover takes the attack as if they were the original intended target in the first place. This can be demonstrated simply by having an enemy strike the paladin with whatever defensives you want active directly, and then testing again through cover. The damage should be the same. Part of the reason why any other solution would be quite strange is that a lot of players tend to forget in this confusion that you also have physical and magic defense, and if, for instance, cover was used on another tank, even without defensive cooldowns, if both players' quote-unquote mitigation applied, then the first tank's tenacity and armor itself would impact the damage that passed on to the paladin. Thankfully, this chaos is just myth and legend. Conclusion: the paladin's mitigation is the only one that applies. 2. If a paladin uses cover and hallowed ground, they can have 2 players survive lethal damage. An interesting detail that some players overlook about cover is that its tooltip quite clearly states that it does not activate with certain attacks. Hallowed ground, similarly, says it makes you impervious to most attacks. Both effectively leave the door open for exceptions. For example, hallowed ground will not block most hardened rage mechanics. Exactly what cover does and does not apply to is complicated, as even something like Suzaku's forced march can, apparently, supposedly, be redirected by cover. However, the damage and effects applied by cover are on the list of things hallowed ground does not protect you from, meaning that if a paladin were to cover their co-tank while using hallowed ground on themselves, they better have enough additional defensive cooldowns to survive taking the tank buster the other tank was meant to take. Typically, AoE attacks that would have killed both the paladin and their cover target will also be ignored by cover in those cases, but there have been specific instances where players have managed to cover someone else anyway due to the way area of effect mechanics tend to burst out from the center, meaning that a paladin using hallowed ground and cover standing closer to the origin point of the attack might be able to first take their own hit and survive with invuln, and then cover their friend and promptly die. However, the general conclusion is that cover strikes through hallowed ground, and this can be tested simply by using cover on a friend actively taking damage and then using hallowed ground. 3. What happens if you have 3 paladins and Paladin 1 covers Paladin 2 and Paladin 2 covers Paladin 3? The suggestion from this question is that Paladin 1 takes the damage both Paladin 2 and 3 should take. The reality is that cover itself is one of the types of effects that cover itself does not activate on, as per the tooltip. This means that if all 3 paladins were hit by an attack, then Paladin 1 takes the damage directed at themselves. They also take the damage from the direct hit to Paladin 2. Paladin 2 only takes the damage directed at Paladin 3, and Paladin 3 takes no damage. It is probably easier to observe this test if only Paladin 2 and 3 are actively being hit. 4. What if 2 Paladins cover the same player? Very, very easy to test. If 2 Paladins cover the same third target, the first cover is replaced by the second cover, meaning only one cover is present at the end of the day. 5. What if 2 Paladins cover each other? Exactly what you think would happen, happens. Paladin A takes Paladin B's damage, and Paladin B takes Paladin A's damage. 6. How about actions that apply effects, such as knockbacks? Unless the particular effect is designated as ignoring cover, then the effect is redirected to the Paladin without failure. One example of this is in E10, where the boss performs multiple small hits that apply stacks of vulnerability to the main tank, followed by a tank buster. A Paladin can use cover to redirect these stacks. Another funny example for demonstrating knockbacks is the first boss in Malika's Well, as it performs a predictable knockback every minute or so. Not only can you test that the knockback is redirected by covering your friend as they get hit, if you both get hit while you cover them, the knockback is twice as potent. 7. Blue Mage's Avail. This action is, with only one exception, a perfect copy of the exact inverse effect of cover, meaning indeed that a chain of avails will only redirect damage once each, just like cover. 2 blue mages availing each other just trades damage, and indeed, if you use avail on a paladin with hallowed ground, they still take your damage. The one sole exception where they are different is that where 2 covers on one player causes one of them to disappear, you can avail one other player while a separate paladin covers you. If you do this, cover takes priority, which sort of makes sense, since cover is a paladin willingly offering to take the damage for you, while avail is you choosing that other person to die for you, if that's what it takes. 8. What if a paladin uses cover on you, and you use avail on them? Both effects will apply, however, the damage will only be transferred once. Presumably, this is why cover plus avail with separate destinations lead to the cover taking priority, as it means in the same way here that cover simply takes priority as long as it is in effect. Number 2. Macros don't buffer input like oGCDs do. A slightly confusing statement, but it is exactly what the claim was presented as. Now, in Final Fantasy XIV, regular action buttons all have so-called action buffering, which many, me included, tend to refer to as spell queuing, quote-unquote. What this means is that when you press an action, the game recognizes that input and holds it in reserve for over half a second to send it when possible. This massively helps with making sure your actions are sent exactly when possible, even if you press too soon. A bit like coyote time in platformers, a mechanic where the game gives you a bit of leniency and allowing you to jump even though technically your character is jumping on air now. Action buffering applies to all actions, and somewhat recently also applies to sprint and even gem drafts, I believe. Which is to say, this buffering in the claim applies not only to oGCDs, but also to GCDs and certain items. Sprint is technically not defined as a weapon skill, spell, or ability, and still has this mechanic. However, macros, on the other hand, do not have action buffering at all. The way macros in Final Fantasy XIV work is that when pressed, it plays each line of the macro, one line per frame of gameplay. And that's really it. The only way you can impact this timing is that the wait modifier to macros can delay a macro by whole integer seconds. While putting extra decimals in doesn't make it fail to function, it rounds these numbers, leading to still a whole number of seconds. You're welcome to test it if you don't believe me. A way you can imitate action buffering on macros is by repeating a line multiple times. However, even if you spent every line of a macro on that, this would only add up to 15 frames of quote-unquote buffering, which, if you play on a stable 60 FPS, pretty common these days, is only a quarter of a second. This behavior is also the reason why you may likely find it necessary to mash macro buttons a lot more than regular buttons, as you kinda need to mash it more to make sure it goes out on time, while a regular button has over half a second of leeway as long as you press it in advance. The buffering can also sometimes lock you into something you didn't want if you accidentally press an action, and even though you pressed the action you actually meant in time, it might have already locked in the wrong input. Number 3. Flamethrower sucks! It does so little damage! Flamethrower is an action with some history. After the machinist rework of Shadowbringers, the action suffered from a problem that its cone was 2/3 of the length of your other AoE buttons, meaning that even if it did more damage, or even just the same damage, it likely missed some targets, making that sort of irrelevant. The meme reached its pinnacle with Dawntrail, where the filler combo of Scattergun and Auto Crossbow averaged 80 potency per second combined, while Flamethrower itself did, you guessed it, 80 potency per second. So there was very little reason to even bother with it in the first place. Then later, Flamethrower's potency was boosted, and its range was finally upgraded to match the competition. Since then, Scattergun and its lower level counterpart Spreadshot has also received significant potency nerfs, which makes Flamethrower look better by comparison. Now, some of you might already be laughing at the fact it was compared to Auto Crossbow in the first place, but let's take the misconceptions one step at a time. Pretty much all dots in Final Fantasy XIV tick exactly every 3 seconds. This also applies for HOTS and even applies for placed AoEs like a ninja's Doton. However, Flamethrower is none of those things. It, as well as Blue Mage's Phantom Flurry and Apocalypsis, are channeled actions, quote-unquote. And these hit every second, as well as an extra time when the cast starts, similar to placed AoEs like ninja's Doton. This means that Flamethrower deals a combined 1100 potency over 11 seconds. Yes, 1100 over 11 seconds. This already makes Flamethrower look a lot better than at a glance. If we compare Flamethrower to your AoE filler rotation options, it also doesn't look too shabby. On 3 targets, Flamethrower is 300 potency per second. By comparison, Scattergun is 156, and Blazing Shot, with the checks, is a hilariously astounding 445. However, considering that you need 5 Scatterguns for every 5 Blazing Shots, the average potency between them becomes 264.5 on 3 targets, significantly below Flamethrower. It should also come as no surprise that more targets makes Flamethrower look even better. Granted, Flamethrower never beats Auto Crossbow on its own, but Flamethrower has the very convenient advantage that it doesn't cost anything. Furthermore, at levels below 94, Flamethrower beats Auto Crossbow outright, and below level 92, so without the checks, Blazing Shot doesn't stand a chance either. So, in conclusion, Flamethrower is still a very weird action, and it isn't like amazingly strong, but it is worth using on AoE. Most definitely. Number 4. Arm's length doesn't get affected by diminishing returns like defensives normally do. Diminishing returns sounds like it is some sort of built-in mechanic of the game, carefully designed to make stacking defensives weaker than not stacking them. However, diminishing returns, at least in this case, is actually just a result of how math works. Damage boosting effects, as well as damage reduction effects in Final Fantasy XIV, are all added together multiplicatively, meaning A times B times C. I have a whole video on this topic if you're interested in the deeper cut. Now, when you have multiple positive multipliers, this compounds the effect and makes them better the more you have. Increasing your damage by 10% twice increases your damage by 21% rather than 20%. However, in the same way, when you have multiple negative multipliers, the effect is inverted. Reducing your damage taken by 10% twice first reduces the damage you take to 90% and then to 81% rather than 80%. Now, this claim that arm's length is not affected by this interaction originates from the logic that arm's length doesn't reduce damage taken or done, it just makes the target swing slower. Arm's length's effect increases the time between swings by 20%, essentially meaning that in the time where the enemy before could swing 6 times, they can now only swing 5. Now, let's take a simple example. Let's say you use the defensive cooldown that reduces damage taken by 10%, like, say, Oblation from a Dark Knight. So you're taking 90% damage. Your opponent will hit you 6 times for 100 damage in the relevant time frame we're investigating, meaning they will strike for 600 damage, reduced by 10%, so 540. Now, here are 2 cases. First, we use another invented defensive cooldown that reduces damage taken by exactly 1/6, which would mean that we reduce that 90% down to 75% due to how diminishing returns work. This would make you take only 450 damage in total, as each swing now only deals 75 damage. Second case, we use arm's length to slow down the opponent's swing timer, and now they can only fit 5 swings in this time frame instead of 6. 5 times 90 is 450. In conclusion, arm's length is just as much affected by diminishing returns as any other defensive, just differently. Number 5. Damage buffs don't affect the limit break, sure, but my Dokumori is a debuff on the target, so it works. False. In a previous episode, we went over exactly how limit breaks work in detail, and even covered the fact that limit breaks do not benefit from damage buffs, with the express exception that some bosses may have unique effects that do affect it. This then led to someone bringing up the claim that some players believe that, while yes, limit break is obviously not affected by damage buffs, that would be absurd, effects like Dokumori are not damage buffs, and so they must be affected. After all, it's on the target, not the user, right? As it turns out, limit breaks don't care about Dokumori or any other damage increasing debuff either. Again, with the express exception that maybe a boss here or there may have uniquely offered a debuff of their own that does work. This one can also easily be demonstrated. Simply hop into any dungeon in Explorer mode as a ninja. Use any limit break you desire to test on the dummy, take note of how much damage it does, then use Dokumori and do it again. Observe that the damage is the same. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you happen to come across or have a myth or claim you would like explained or tested. I do keep a list of these, so just because I didn't cover yours yet, doesn't necessarily mean I skipped it. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, in PvP, the way certain placed AoEs can function in a reasonable way with dots and themselves ticking every 3 seconds, despite their durations not being a multiple of 3, is that placed AoEs in PvP apply a 5-second dot to the target every 3 seconds. Just enough that it ticks twice, but not thrice. Notable examples of this include Doton, Salted Earth, and Mesotes, although that last one does last a multiple of 3 seconds.